Okay. All right, great. My name is Andrew Prisk, and tonight I'm going to be talking about secure software development cycle, and really to kind of narrow that, because that's a very broad topic, right? It's going to be with an emphasis on mobile application development. So a little bit about me. I've been in tech since 1998. Before that, I was in the military for a while. And I've worked in higher ed. I've worked as director of IT for a CPA firm. I've done consulting. I worked for a large public utility, and then I've had several startups sprinkled in there. And most recently, I was at a startup, or I have a startup still in Charlotte, and then I just most recently started one because of the pandemic here in Winston that's services based, and that's really that's what all the startups I've had have been services based except for one, and I really enjoy that. So let's get started. So here's the agenda. The first thing we're going to talk about is teams, securing the life cycle, going through all the different phases, and then talking about transition and implementation, which is probably the hardest thing to talk about. So software development's been around, and I'm sure a lot of you are well versed in it. It's been around since, I think, 1970. It was really embraced in 1974. It was even in place before that. There was a guy at I think and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe his name is Boyce, that kind of formalized the SDLC when he was at Lockheed. And that he didn't, I don't think it was ever called waterfall at the time, but that's really what it became. And then, and there's been just so many different iterations, and I'll go through that too. But it's been, it's since it's been around, and in its latest iteration, and there's always been an application for mobile in some way, shape, or form. It's been ever more present since 2010. And both the SDLC and SSDLC have been particularly tricky to navigate for mobile app developers and smaller development shops as a whole, simply because, since smartphones came out, and since there's been this need for developing apps, most of them have been developed by individuals or a few individuals, not really big teams. It's just very non-traditional. And so formalizing their process has really been tricky to try to adapt that. And as we all know here recently, even, with the advent of SSDLC or DevSecOps in 2015, 2016, that's really been, it's been more important, I think, for mobile apps, but it's often overlooked. Let's see. So I'll start with building a team, because for me, I've been building teams for a while, and I think for me, before you talk about any type of formalized process, before you talk about building anything, before you even talk about an SDLC or a methodology therein, you really have to have a good team behind you. You have to, and for mobile development, really for any development effort, it has to be right sized, right? You can't have so much bloat that nothing gets done. The hangover picture here is exactly right. I worked in corporate for a while, and that's just that's understated, right? That is just so accurate. Except, maybe you, depending on the size of the corporation, maybe you've got 20 people and you've got 3 people doing the majority of the work. And the rest are, they're playing different levels of drama actor, I guess. But anyhow, so for me, building a team or starting with that foundation is just most important before you even talk about starting with any type of development, right? So it has to be right sized, and you have to build a team for longevity. And so, whenever I've put together a team, I've never thought, okay, I'm willing to build this team for this job, and that's it. And then it'll be done, and then I'll go build another team. Because I learned through a lot of pain that doing that, standing up those quick teams, rarely results in any type of longevity, right? Any type of longevity for the product, for the application, for the company that wants it built or you're building it for. And so, and this might surprise some of you. I have only had, I've built 2 mobile teams since 2009, and that's it. And the first one I left. The second one I am still working with. They have been, from my perspective, they've been curated, they've been cherry picked, they have been, mentored, and they are fantastic people. And I know not everybody can do that, but from my perspective, at least for a mobile app development team or any type of development team, if you're able to do that, you're going to have just much more success. Along with that goes cross training. And so, like right now on my team, I've got a primary iOS developer, a primary Android developer. Both of them stay in their lane, but they are also cross trained to develop in iOS and Android. So conversely, so they can check each other's work. Or if we need to bring in a third party, which we it's not really a third party. We have a cybersecurity professional on our team. That is also, he was in a previous life, he was a developer. And so he does code reviews too, which is, so cross training across the board is extremely important. And I'll talk more about that when I start going through the different phases or the traditional phases of SDLC. And then most importantly for me, at least when I'm building a team, is hiring for character. And I'm sure that, all of your cybersecurity professionals, I'm not, but this should resonate with all of you, especially. You have to have a team that you can trust, right? You have to have a team that you can work with, that, they're all adults, right? But they're going to do their job. You don't have to worry about that or babysit them. And that's probably the hardest part of putting together this team. And that goes hand in hand with the very last bullet there, letting go of ego. I have fired rock stars before just because they were terrible people. They were incredibly brilliant, incredibly skilled, but they were terrible people. And in this day and age, you really just can't afford to have that, right? You can't tolerate that. So, and people like that, are really looking for that type of experience anyways, right? They need to eat some humble pie, at least in my opinion. Outside of building the team, I'm just going to quickly touch on that, the type of team members I have. And some of you might relate to this. Some of you might work in shops that are much, much bigger and maybe smaller. But for me, I've got 7 individuals that make up this team. I've got platform developers, iOS and Android, the cybersecurity professionals, or professional that is also, he's skilled in DevSecOps. He's very good at that. Marketing, advertising professional, somebody to get the word out, a graphic designer, and sometimes, depending on the person, if they're particularly adroit, then you could combine those two, right? Marketing, advertising, graphic designer. Some creative that also gets it, right? That's not full of drama. A project manager, somebody that can control all the chaos. A backend developer, and an infrastructure professional. So somebody that can, that can stand, and sometimes those are the same person too, depending on how talented they are, how much experience they have. And this is what currently makes up my team. And there are varying degrees of this, right? So you might have more of one thing versus another, and that really depends. That goes back to right sizing. It really depends on the project or the application. And so it's always good to have people that you can talk to or ready standbys, even though you have this main team that you're working with. And that is a good, I think I wrote in my notes, that's a good segue into SDLC. and it is. It was, started as waterfall in actually, I think that date's wrong. I think that's when it was presented, but I don't think it was actually enacted or put in place until 1974. And it came from SDM, or what was SDM. And I think that originally was used at Xerox. And I might be wrong on that, but I think that's right. And yeah, it was introduced as a project management model for software. Now there are, 10, 14, 15 different methodologies, significant methodologies, and those are actually, they seem to be, it's an evolutionary process, right? You figure out what works, or the development community or the project management community, and now including the security community, has to respond to trends and technology. With growth, it has to evolve, and so does the model, so does the methodology. So the different models, traditionally there were 5 different phases, and now depending on methodology, there are actually 7, or people say there are 7. For me, I think I like to work efficiently, and so for me, breaking it further down into planning and analysis, and then testing and implementation is really kind of cumbersome. Because we're a small team, we work well together, we trust each other, we know how each other works. That can be condensed, and you can still get the work done. So really, these are great guidelines, but I think I conform, and I operate more under the traditional phases. In fact, maybe there are 6. Right, so maybe it's requirements, and for me, there's scoping, right, which I guess you could call analysis. Maybe it's just semantics, but requirements, and then scoping, and then design, development, verification, and maintenance. And I don't know, I want to back up just a second when I'm talking about the team. Do any of you, I really want this to be kind of interactive and immersive. Do any of you have any experiences with team, or anything you want to share with your team building, or how you build a team? Nobody builds teams. Okay. Well, to me, it's very important when you're applying SDLC to anything, any type of development effort. The team is extremely important. So the timeline, I do have a great graphic for the SDLC timeline. And I call it the evolution timeline because that's exactly what it is. So we start with SDLC waterfall, born from SDM, all the way up to DevSecOps in 2016. Actually, DevOps and DevSecOps were around, I think, I want to say the first time I heard about DevSecOps was AWS Invent in 2016. I know it had been around, or there had been some loose collaboration calling it that, but I think that's the first time I actually saw it presented. And if anybody knows differently, please correct me. But I think that's right. And some of you might be familiar with all of these, or maybe even operated under some of these, or developed under some of these. Object-oriented programming was huge. It was a game changer. In the late 90s, it was amazing. I didn't really get into development until maybe 1999, 2000. But object-oriented programming it still remains big, especially in corporations. Corporations they're changing, but it's like turning an aircraft carrier, right? It's not fast at all. And so there's a lot of bastardized versions of different methodologies out there. Some are doing it better than others, and some not. For some, they're just guidelines. The SDLC phases, the traditional phases, and here are the security enhancements that now these are right. I'll go through each one, but requirements gathering and even scoping. Phase 1 is risk assessment, right? And I'm sure you guys are, and I'm really approaching this from the other side of maybe where you are. I don't know how many developers were on this call, or how many development managers might be on this call, but for me, I'm not a cybersecurity professional. However, I know enough to know that I've been preaching to the choir since probably 2012 that security needs to be an inherent part of anything we do or anything that we release. And particularly, I was working for a public company, particularly, you're already going through SOX audits, and you're already going through change management. it was very important to have security back then. We didn't really have a formalized name for it, but it was very important. And so from the very beginning, and honestly, as a developer, as a development manager, trying to grab a network engineer or a security engineer and have them look over code or have them look at something and try to look at and tell them, hey, can you look at my application and see what attack vectors are? And there's a blank stare, like, you're such an idiot. I have so many better things to do than this. And so there was push and pull, right? And on the flip side of that, now cybersecurity professionals are going to developers and they're saying, we really need to look at this before you release it, because you could be exposing the entire company. The developers are, all right. So risk assessment to me is always, whenever you're doing requirements gathering, and whenever I'm doing that, whenever I'm approaching a new development effort, new app, after I do the initial meeting with the customer or client, I immediately get on the phone with the cybersecurity guy and say, listen, I need you involved. When can you meet with me to go through requirements, or when do you have time to go meet with the customer and we'll talk about the feature set they want? Just right from the very beginning, getting them involved and getting their input is just critical. I've seen a lot of shops wait until they're in phase 4, verification QA, or even maintenance, to engage security, and that is such a mistake. It absolutely has to be done at the very beginning, and that way there's complete transparency, complete visibility to the entire development cycle, and there are no surprises. And then secondary to that, design that just bleeds right into that. So the cybersecurity professional can start doing their threat modeling, right? They can start looking at all the feature sets and they can start saying, all right, that's not going to work. This will work. Here might be a workaround. And it's good for developers to hear that. And so, and I think I put that in here at one point. At every phase, except for development, I try to involve every member of my team, particularly in phase 1 and 2, requirements gathering, scoping, design. I try to get all of them involved because they're smart people, they're creative. They might think of something, or they might think of something that we didn't, right? That the project manager or somebody else didn't think of. And so it's good for me. It's good to involve them in those two. Now, I will stand fast at development. In no world should a developer be making product decisions as they're developing. Oh, so bad. Because, developers are great. They're creative people. They're smart people, but they go down rabbit holes fast. And they end up over-engineering something minute that shouldn't be. So by the time the developers are handed what they need to build, the threat model needs to be done, the process diagram needs to be done, all the design needs to be done. They just need to be handed a package saying, go build, and then we'll review. And that applies really to any type of methodology, whether it's agile or not. It doesn't matter. For me, that handing that off to them and telling them to go build, and they have very concise requirements, is just so important. Phase 3, development static analysis, right? And so as they're building this, they need to go through every piece or every tool, and they need to take into account everything that the cybersecurity professional has put in the notes or has put into the package for them to build. That's critical too, but that becomes, if they listen or they didn't listen, or they did or they didn't do, that becomes more apparent in phase 4, right? Verification, QA, security testing. Great place for them to start introducing different testing plans, automated tools, automated security tools, and also setting up for a longer term cycle, right? Everybody thinks that when you build software, it's one and done. Oh, I built an app, it's done. But that's not true, right? Whether it's a corporation or whether it's a small accounting firm, if you're building an app or you're building, maybe it's a contact manager that they're using internally, it doesn't matter. That it has a life, and the life cycle part of this usually falls short, or it's usually lost on a lot of dev shops. They don't take care of maintenance. They don't think about maintenance. They don't care about maintenance. They want to get the job done and be done. But maintenance is important, and maintenance for the life of the application, for the life of the app. All the security testing needs to be done at regular intervals, and that needs to be baked into any type of maintenance contract, any type of patch cycle, anything. All of that, it has to be constantly considered, and it's very often not. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing the fruits of everybody's labor of ignorance in all the ransomware that's hitting. I mean, turn on the TV and there's a ransomware hack anywhere, everywhere, all the time. And a lot of it can be traced back to a few things, right? And one of probably three different things. And one of those is poor software development. And I'm a developer. I'm a development manager, so I'm particularly hard on developers because I just know how they can be. So I'll start going through these different phases specifically. Requirements gathering. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns so far on what I've covered for SDLC or their take on it? Or maybe they have a different take in their shop?
I was going to just add one thing, and I apologize, I joined just a couple minutes late, but echoing agreement with everything that you're talking about, Andrew. And I don't think you had said this, but it's as critical for everything that we're talking about that this be incorporated all the way back left in development work, right? This isn't about just the things as they're getting to production. We've got to shift left all the way. And as example, like you can just look at the T-Mobile event that was publicized last week. The threat factor for that came in through development. Like that was a development error that was taken advantage of. So it's really, really key that we do this stuff as early as possible.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yep. I agree. Yep. Yep. Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. That's why, at least for me, for projects that I take on, I engage my cyber guy as like I said, after the first or second meeting with the customer or client, and we sign a deal or whatever, he's right there with me through the duration. He not so much during the development, because when they get to the development part, he's done his job. He's handed them a package, and so it is incumbent for them to develop it correctly. And if they don't, and of course, I'm very fortunate because the guy I use has a development background, and so as a part of the verification QA and the code reviews, he's in the middle of that, and so he's actually able to see if they're doing it correctly instead of they're adults, we don't micromanage them. But he's able to see what they've done and if they've listened and if they've tried to adhere to what he said. And so I'm very, very fortunate. Not everybody has access to that, but I'm very fortunate in that respect. And so it works very well to put him in with the code reviews during phase 4 or during the verification in QA. But yep, you are absolutely right. Anybody else have any comments about what they've seen? Part of this, I really want this to be interactive because nobody can know everything, right? It's just so important. If you're not learning, you're stagnating. So I would love to hear from you guys about what you've seen, either from team building or from SDLC phases or development horror stories. I would love to hear about that. Okay, well, if you do think of anything, just please interject. Just stop me because I love to hear that stuff too. All right, so the first phase, requirements gathering. It's nobody likes meetings, but it's all about meetings, right? Meetings with the client, with the customer. It's discovering feature sets, things they want. That's the fun part, to talk to them about what is possible. But for everything that is possible, or for every feature that they want, there's a corresponding risk assessment that has to be done. Either as, what footprint does this have? What attack vectors are there? What am I exposing the customer to? What am I exposing the network to? All these different things have to be factored in and then included in the scope document, in the workup. And that has to be discussed with the customer and client also. Right, I think part of this entire effort, part of the SDLC, it's not just for developers, but it's also for customers and clients. There's a level of education here that is missing from the general population. especially, executives. I hate to say this. It's just so true, right? And sometimes it's very beneficial because a lot of them are not, they're not techies, right? They don't get it. So you have to make one sheet executive summaries that describe what you're going to do with some graphs, charts, pretty pictures, memes, whatever. So they get it. And you have to water it down because they're not in this business or this industry. And so, but it's but that level of education, even for the people that don't really understand it, up to and including horror stories, there needs to be some level of fear about what can happen if it's not done correctly. And so, and everything's influenced by that, right? Whether it's the timeline, whether it's the feature set, everything is. And so it's just so important to, after the requirements gathering is done, the scope document, the worksheet, it's so important to go back to the customer and client and say, all right, here's what it's going to take, and here's why we have to do these things. And by the way, we have to cancel or we can't use these different features, or we have to modify these features because of the security risk. And I don't think that's really being done a lot with a lot of development shops. But I think, that's very key. And again, right from the beginning, what you said before, right from the beginning, this has to be incorporated. Next is design, right? For me, the rest of the team, my entire team has input in the design. The scope document's done or the worksheet's done. We all get together, we look at it, we talk about it, we talk about what needs to be done. After that, the data models are worked up, the process diagram is worked up, the security or the risk assessments and security risks are applied to those. And so we can see at different junctures, what the security risk is, what are we doing for mitigation. All of that's done during design, and everybody has input. Everybody's the same. Everybody has input, whether it's valuable to one person or not as a material. Everybody has input because everybody has visibility. Again, transparency at every level is so key for the team, right? Nobody is an island, and really just can't afford to be. Not in this day and age. So the design is for me is a really critical part, really critical phase. If you get the design right, everything else should go well, right? You shouldn't have, except of course, you're always going to have bugs that you don't intend. But for the most part, the rest of the cycle will go well. So design is absolutely critical. Development. Implementing design is according to the requirements, the worksheet, all the input, the feedback. The developers I have learned, and again, I'm going to be particularly harsh on developers because I've really worked with some great people and I've worked with some really terrible people. And so developers, and I said at the very beginning, by and large, they're lazy. Right? Their job is born of automation. They want to know how to do something the quickest. And unfortunately, for a lot of the younger kids I'm seeing, that means going to Stack Overflow and cutting and pasting. They don't really understand the mechanics and they don't care. Or they'll find some open source library on some sketchy Ukrainian website that they can use because it does what they want. Never mind what else is embedded, right? I've run into all of that, and it's horrible. It is good to have developers that can cross-check each other's work. Like I said, I have an iOS developer that also has built Android apps. That's not his primary job function, but he can do code reviews. And I have an Android developer that is a very skilled Swift developer, and so he can do iOS code reviews. And so they check each other's work. And then, and I talked about this previously, in the next phase is when I introduce the cybersecurity professional, because again, he's got a development background. And so he starts doing, a different level of code review, which is great. And, establishing coding standards right from the get-go is also important to the organization. And I know a lot of people that talk about SDLC really, really harp on coding standards. And I can appreciate that. But in my experience, the coding standards, it really is dependent upon the type of project and the type of team that you have, right? What works for a 10,000 person company, what works for Boeing is not going to work for my team. I promise you. And so, coding standards are very, very important, but it's entirely dependent on the effort. And another thing, I'll talk about this with development and verification. I've got a great story. Actually, it's not a great story. It was a little scary at the time, a little sketchy. When I was working at the public utility contractor, this was I think it was when the iPad first came out. So I want to say it was 2010. And we were going to be the first construction company to have iPads out in the field. We had 3,500 people we were going to deploy them to, and we were going to automate a lot of the processes. Great idea. I went shopping for an iOS developer, and I found a guy that was well-versed in Objective-C. I mean, he was a rock star, smart, brilliant, really sharp, incredibly good. And as things progressed and he started shooting out builds, I realized it was too good. Something something was rubbing me the wrong way. And so when he was done with what he thought was his first version, we started doing a code review, and we cracked open the code, which he did not expect us to do, and he admitted to that later. And I saw all of these confidentiality statements and copyright headers. And I confronted him about it, and I was like, what is this? He's like, oh, I didn't know you were going to look at the code. And previous to working for us, he had worked at one of the top 2 telecommunications companies they were one of the very first, they were the first carrier to work with Apple at the time to produce different apps. And he had been one of their lead developers. And I saw all this copyright information. I confronted him about it, and he's like, oh, I didn't know you were going to do a code review. Well, in fact, it was IP theft. He had stolen a whole bunch of code from them and just thought it was okay to cut and paste. And so, I was shocked. I was just shocked by the audacity. I was like, wow. I was so surprised that it was just so blatant. And so to mitigate, I fired him immediately, and I had to rehire that position, and we had to rewrite all of that code. And luckily, a lot of people don't think about IP theft, even though it's probably the most prevalent form of cybercrime out there right now. If this because we're a public company, this was in development, right? There's no staging, hadn't gone to production yet. Fortunately, and I consult an internal audit, we didn't have to disclose it because we were able to scrap all that code and rewrite it from scratch. Had it gone to production, it would have been, me and my entire team, probably the entire IT department would have got let go because it would have been that severe. It would have been such a breach, not only in trust and confidentiality, but the public fallout would have been horrible. And so fortunately, we were able to catch it when we did. So again, for development and also for verification, code reviews are essential, right? Not just for IP theft like that, which was so blatant, but also just to make sure everybody's doing what they need to do, and they're not missing anything that was in the original requirement scope document or design. So code reviews, at least from my perspective, are extraordinarily important. Does anybody have any great stories about IP theft that they'd like to share? Please anonymize or generalize it if you can.
I have one.
Sure.
The company I used to work for, here, let me stop here. Company I used to work for, we developed, you know how you go to the hospital and they scan your wristband and they ask you your name, the 2 patient identifiers. The company I worked for wrote that. The very first customer was Johns Hopkins. It was very exciting. It went out to all the hospitals. I don't think you can go to a hospital or anywhere where they don't use that technology. And our competitor actually stole the code and started using it and selling it. And I worked for a Navy SEAL at the time, and he had hidden some wording in his coding that specifically Mary had a little lamb. So when they went to court, we won that battle. over the source code. So lots and lots of attorney calls later. They weren't able to sell that anymore. So that's my little story.
Yeah, well, I think it's coming to light now, but I think IP theft, or it's just, I guess it's getting more attention now, more headlines. I think a lot of people, and probably all of you, have known about it for quite some time. I think IP theft is probably one of the biggest risks for cyber crimes that is out there. And again, that goes back to me really railing against the current development set, right? I was talking about hiring good teams. I can't tell you how many 20-something-year-olds I've interviewed. On paper, they're amazing, right? They did interns at Google, they did interns at Square, they did all these great internships. On paper, they're amazing. They start coding, and again, they amount, I'm sorry for this term, but they amount to nothing more than script kiddies, right? They go and they cut and paste code, or they build widgets, or they find these automated tools that will build code for them, and suddenly they are a developer, and they know better than everybody else. And again, that lends itself to IP theft, right? It's really, really important that when you're building the team, the developers they're true developers, they're programmers, they understand programmatic theory, regardless of whatever language and syntax they're using. It's so important that they understand that, and they understand the mechanics of what they're building. And a lot of that gets lost. Because when hiring managers are hiring people, and these people slip through all the algorithms, right? Because they hit all the high notes on the resume. It's so important that they understand that. They look great on paper. But that's my rant against developers.
Andrew, I think a person can actually reframe the IP theft around open source also. I think there's a significant number of companies that are out there that are deploying applications using open source that may have GPL in it or some other type of licensing that doesn't actually meet the compliance standards that are probably necessary for using that code in the form that company happens to be using it. And that in itself is also an IP theft. So
right. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I haven't gotten to that yet, but I was absolutely going to talk about OSS, because that is, that's also such a huge vulnerability. Now, I'm not against using open source software as long as it's used properly and there's attribution, as you just mentioned, and it's clean, right? That's the biggest problem with using open source software, and that's where, again, I really lucked out with my cyber guy, because he can scan for those things and he checks for those things. And he was using a dashboard, and I don't remember. For the life of me, I don't remember, but it was basically a collection of all the different licenses. And they would, you would submit a license that was included with open source, and they would scan it for you and point out key parts. It was, if I remember that, I'll send it out to the group. The software that they were using, it was expensive, but it was very good. Anyhow, yes, OSS. That is such a good point. That is a key point entry for IP theft. Right, ripping off attribution or changing variables, or it's still IP theft, right? I'm all for using IP or not. I'm all for using open source as long as there's proper attribution, and it is good, right? It's not going to create a vulnerability or some type of licensure issue down the road. Verification. Again, and in my notes here, I actually put, watch out for IP theft, hugely prevalent in today's dev world. And this is, I think this is a slide I was actually going to rail on developers about. And I'm hard on developers because I am a developer, and because I know developers and I understand how they work. And and I'll talk about this in transition a little bit, but it's really, really hard. And again, we're on two different sides of the fence here, right? You guys are you guys are cybersecurity professionals. I'm not. I'm filling the role of development manager right now, and so, and it's not a natural marriage between cybersecurity, which has finite rules, and it has compliance issues, and there are things that have to be done and not done, and developers who are, they're laid back. They're very, very fluid. That's probably the best way I can put it. But anyhow, so verification, testing builds, quality assurance, including unit integration, system acceptance testing. Again, all of those are very, very important. I've seen a lot of unit testing actually happening during development, which is great. Again, depending on methodology, that might happen, might not. I usually save it for verification. I save it for this after the development's done. And again, that is entirely project dependent. So if I'm building like a 3 or 4 screen app that doesn't do much, right, just has static content, maybe a little CRM behind it, something like that. Again, I can wait till the development's done and then we can check it because it's small, because it's not a huge effort. If I'm building this huge platform that is, going to take 6 to 8 months, you better believe we're doing unit testing. We're applying Agile to every step of that, or we're utilizing one of the Agile methodologies. And this is also for SSDLC. This is a great place to introduce all the security scans, vulnerability testing, the automated tools that will be later used in maintenance. This is the place to introduce it. And then of course, maintenance, right? Maintenance is really important. Now, maintenance is really important for a couple of different reasons. Not only is it important to the life cycle, right? It's good to be able to have long-term maintenance schedules, code checkups, patches, upgrades, things like that. What a lot of development shops, particularly independent development shops, miss out on as a business opportunity even, is maintenance contracts, right? They sit there, they get the initial engagement letter signed or proposal to build this application, to build this app. And and it's either their idea or the corporation's idea to say, all right, then you can hand it off to our team to maintain. Well, okay, you can do that. However, if you build the maintenance package and maintenance plan correctly, that turns into a whole new contract, right? All of a sudden, as a business, you've got recurring revenue, which is just incredibly, probably much more important than the initial contract. And so, and as a part of that, or as a part of the SSDLC, is incorporating quarterly or biannual or annual scans, depending on what it is, into that maintenance contract, into that maintenance plan. And so the company, the corporation, whoever you're building for, is automatically covered. And this extends very, very well now to app building, to mobile apps, right? Because they are not secure. I don't care what anybody says. Android used to be, everybody thought iOS was nice and safe and secure, and Android was the wild, wild west. Okay, but now it's evening up a little bit. Google's gotten a little bit better about security, and iOS has gotten a little bit worse about security. And so it's still very, very important. And even, I guess, and maybe I'm wrong, is Microsoft going to embrace Android, or are they still holding on to Windows Mobile? Does anybody know? Has anybody heard? I don't know. But that would be another platform to look at, right? But really, it's primarily iOS and Android. Okay, any questions, comments, concerns of what I've covered for 5 phases?
I threw a comment in the chat, but I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I'd argue that quarterly security scans and reviews is not sufficient. With ephemeral infrastructure, with the use of cloud-based resources, we need to be adopting continuous security scanning, evaluation of that infra. Otherwise, you'll have a breach in your system and you won't know about it till 90, 120 days later. And that's just too late.
Right. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because, I would, my only counterpoint to that would be, it depends on what you're building. Right. And you're right, if it has a huge footprint, like a cloud application or something like that, or it's particularly exposed, 100%. And the only reason I say anything about that is because when you're building the maintenance contracts, and again, this is part of the incorporation of security into the entire SDLC or into the entire development effort, is an education for these companies or corporations. They have to understand the cost, right? Not just the cost of building, but the cost of maintenance and the cost of security. Continuous security monitoring, absolutely, if they can afford it. But what I think what some companies are running into is that they don't want to afford it. And again, that goes back to education, and it's just so, it is important. You're right, testing and scans, so important. And if they can do continuous, I 110% agree with that.
And to that last point you just made, I think that really does come down more to the people aspect, right? I think from a tools and a technology perspective, there's an awful lot of ways that can be accomplished with open source tools and with tools that they may not have all the bells and whistles of some of the paid contract products out there, but it can be done. But the challenge is we've got so many people in industry now who are accustomed to what they were doing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and have the mentality that it's good enough, and they don't adopt and change. And I think that's where the biggest challenge is in industry today.
Yeah, you're right. When I was working for that utility, that's absolutely right, because they're developers that have been there for 20 years. They were planning to be there another 20 and retiring. And corporate developers, particularly, or corporate employees as a whole, and some of you might have run into this already, they're very territorial, right? We've always done it like this. Why do we need to change? I'm not going to change. And I'm going to make your life 10 times harder because I don't want to change. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that attitude is extremely prevalent in dev shops and corporations. Some are getting more progressive than others, and they're tackling that problem by setting up, building new teams. But yeah, that is a huge problem also.
It's definitely getting better. I mean, you even just look at the recent government announcements this week about, looking for those advancements and focus on cybersecurity, and just all of the work that's been happening in government in the last, couple, 3-5 years. I've been involved in a lot of that previously, but like that's trickling down. It's trickling down to these smaller shops as well. So we're getting there. We're getting a whole lot better.
That's awesome. That's good to hear. It's very good to hear. Anybody else have anything before I move on? I promise I just have a few more slides, and some of them have some funny memes. So after the phases, I'm going to talk about transition and implementation, right? And I've talked about this, I've harped on it already. The approach is dependent on team and methodology. From my experience and perspective, smaller teams are more nimble and they respond better to not only change, but also embracing these new techniques, especially incorporation of security, right? When I first brought the cybersecurity guy in, the developers were a little hesitant. They really weren't sure what to expect until we did the first project together. And after that, and they, again, it was education for the developers too, and the developers have to be willing to respond. They were okay. But it did, there was some adjustment period. So I've broken it down into 3 different things: coaching developers, concise requirements, and building for scale. And there's probably 1,000 other things we could talk about for transition implementation, but for me, these were the most important. Coaching developers. So introducing security awareness to the development team, paramount. What I just talked about, they have to be on board. They have to have buy-in. More senior developers certainly will, especially if they've been contractors or they've been consultants. They understand a lot better. It's a lot harder with corporate developers, but they just have to be educated one way or the other. They have to be educated. Make sure secure coding practices are in place. Again, I talked about coding practices. I briefly touched on it. It is very important, but again, that's really dependent upon the team, and that's it depends on the effort, right? Having a plan to deal with vulnerability and patch response, remediation SLAs. Again, great opportunity, a business opportunity for smaller shops to build in that maintenance contract, right? Remediation SLAs, you're telling people up front, and again, this is education for the customer and client, you're telling them, okay, look, nothing is 100% secure. We're doing the best we can. We're going to follow all of our best practices. However, if something happens, if there's an insider attack, if there's IP theft, if there's a bug that crops up that we're not aware of, here's how we're going to deal with it. Again, it's all about transparency and and disclosure. And that's critical, right? Because then you have the executive buy-in. They understand what's happening too. And so if something were to happen, yes, it would suck. Yes, they would be upset, but they would also understand how you're going to take care of it. Very, very important. Concise requirements. Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite memes right there. How long is it going to take? Well, what are your requirements? I don't know. What do you need? It is a vicious cycle. And when you incorporate, when you're in a corporate dev shop, that gets layered, there's several different layers of management that have input on the requirements. And so what should be maybe a 2-week effort suddenly becomes a 6-month or an 8-month effort. When I was, I have a quick story about this too. The mobile effort at this utility, I keep going back there because I have great examples of what to do and what not to do from there. But when I was there, they had tried 2 mobile efforts before with laptops. And they had a whole bunch of project managers and contract people in a room in their corporate office, figuring out what was best for all the guys in the field. And the guys in the field are construction workers. And I'm not sure what it is about a keyboard, but it scares the hell out. So when you give them a tough book, they'll throw it. Well, I ain't using it. And so I took a completely different approach. Many years ago, different incarnation, I ran heavy equipment and was part of an equipment crew. So I was like, I think I know how to do this. It was great. It was a good opportunity because the iPad was just coming out. And so I went to the field and I was like, all right, could you guys use this? If we built this form to do this. And once they figured out they could take these big sausage fingers they had that were burly and broken, and they could touch the iPad and make it do what they wanted it to do. Oh boy, that was it. It was on. And so, requirements, getting requirements, it again depends on the effort. I hate to keep going back to that, but it's so true. It's really the consultant answer, right? It depends. But it's so true. It was an unconventional approach, but it solved the problem. Not only did it solve the problem, but it was a tremendous success. They were able to carve out and really lead their industry as a result of direct feedback and requirements gathering from the field guys. So it's not always a traditional approach that's going to get you or yield the results that you need for requirements and scoping and worksheet. You have to think, and you have to think a little bit differently. Anyhow. So that, for me, concise requirements are very, very important. Developers write code. They don't need to be making project or product decisions on the fly. Mentioned that before. And again, whole team input should be considered and gathered during the first and second phase. Requirements, scoping, whether you call it planning, analysis, and design, I don't care. All of that, there should be input from the entire team during those phases. And then understanding scale. This is super important too, because I always hear people say, "Oh, we're going to build it so that it's the next Facebook." And when I hear that from either a customer, client, or even a developer, I'm like, no, I don't. No, you're not building the next Facebook, right? They have no concept of scale, right? And so if a developer comes to me and says, okay, I'm going to build this for scale, I want to make sure that our foundation is extensible, that it accommodates all these security requirements, that it would be ready for these different compliance standards should we go out and have to do this, or if we add on in this way or add on that way. Okay, now I understand what you're saying when you say you're going to build for scale. But when very often people put that effort, or they label something as scaling, as being something massive, and really it's just about the underpinnings of the effort. It's the underpinnings of the app, the application, the development effort, and again, all of that starts with the first 2 phases in the team. Transparency and development and maintenance plans are paramount also. When you're talking about scale, when you're talking about longevity, because it is a whole effort, right? It's not just piecemeal, it's not just one and done, it is an entire effort. And really, the development shop or the development team has to embrace that. Whoever's building it has to embrace that, and they have to understand and really want to partner with whoever they're building this for and say, all right, we're looking for a long-term partnership. We're really wanting to build this and grow it and help you grow. And very often that falls short. You don't see that. Any questions, comments about transition implementation? I mean, have you guys had, I would love to hear any war stories you have about implementing SSDLC or any type of security or injecting security into your development efforts. If you're exposed to that or if you're a part of that, I would love to hear anything, any of your experiences.
Yeah, one kind of question / comment I have is, and I've seen this in a couple of places that I've worked at, where basically a developer or a team of developers will work on a project or a platform that, for one reason or another, they are able to successfully call it an exception. And when I say an exception, I don't just mean to security requirements. Perhaps it could be maturity when it comes to, you know, the agile model that the rest of the organization was trying to run. And I think that you mentioned territorialism a little bit earlier, and I think that we see a lot of that. But I just wanted to ask the question, when it comes to these pockets of development organizations that are able to successfully say that they are exceptions to the rule, or their platform, their legacy platform is needed, and we don't need to change anything, how would you approach changing that culture? And is that very common, what I've observed?
Right, that's a great question. And yeah, I've got a great couple of examples there of how to do it and how not to do it. At one point, I was also, before I really focused on development, I was a DBA, I was an enterprise DBA. And I don't know how many DBAs you guys have worked with, but they are, for SOX auditors, they are exception kings, right? I mean, they can come up with an exception and justification like nobody's business. And you know, looking back, it was probably not the best way to do it. And I know our SOX auditor internally absolutely hated me, but the justification was so good, they didn't have a choice. Now, for development, I would go back to the very first and second phase, right? So if a developer came to me and said, or went to the security person and said, this has to be an exception because we've done this the same way, it has to be done this way, I would go back to requirements gathering, I would go back to stakeholders, and I would look at the feature sets. And I would say, okay, well, this person says it has to be done this way, and that's not acceptable. So let's figure this out, right? Do you need this feature? Can this feature be modified? Can we go a different way that satisfies our security requirements? So that's how I would approach it. I wouldn't, because, you know, whenever you, in a corporate environment, whenever you butt heads with anybody, over half of your time is no longer productive. You're dealing with drama, particularly as a manager, right? I mean, you just are. All of a sudden, HR issues crop up. And so it's never a good idea to butt heads with people that are territorial. It's always better to either go above them or go around them and satisfy that requirement some other way. Or at least that was my experience. And I was successful with that. And most of the time, there were two developers in particular that had been at this organization for, one had been there almost 30 years, and the other had been there about like 24. And they'd been there since, in the old system they were using was DB2, green screen, AS400, and that was their world. That's what they were RPG programmers that were transitioning. And so they were very entrenched in how things were to be done. And they had a lot of respect within or an influence within the organization. However, when it came to modernization, it came to these new techniques, it was, at the time, it was not the right way to do it, but I took a brute force approach, right? I to the manager's manager and said, okay, they say we can't do it this way, we have to do it this way. You know, either we support this or we give up this effort entirely because I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to sacrifice this feature because they don't want to do it. And fortunately, because the mobile effort at the time was very new, I was successful. Was that the right way to do it? Probably not. You know, it would have been much better and probably much more PC to include them in the solution and try to win them over and educate them and get their assistance, right? You know, get them on board to a different way of thinking, to a new way of thinking. But I didn't do that. And, you know, in hindsight, it was probably not the best way to do it for me to handle it, but I was successful nonetheless. So that's that's my response. But it was a great question.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask kind of a similar question, and maybe it's a little bit of the same answer. Another observation I have just in shops where there starts to be some added governance, some centralized governance, and development teams are starting to feel the heat. There are these gobs and gobs of vulnerabilities that are found that need to be prioritized and fixed and that kind of thing. And the general response you get is, well, we don't have time. Well, we've always done things this way. And because they're already found themselves to be exceptions, you hit a dead end really quickly. One of the things that I find that I'm just kind of asking, when it comes to those vulnerabilities that the organization has just kind of accepted by default throughout the years, and now there's added governance, and now there's an added layer at the business that is either accepting or mitigating these vulnerabilities. How do you communicate that vulnerability debt? Do you write reports and make sure leadership is aware of the stuff that's been piling up over the years before the governance? How do you, I don't know how to ask this very well, but how do you communicate that debt or those vulnerabilities accepted by default over the years?
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. And it depends on the organization. If they are so entrenched and it's a part of the culture of the organization, it has to be, it has to be top driven. It has to be driven down from the top. And so, you really have to get executive leadership on board with the transition itself or the way things need to be done. And that has to trickle down to middle management. There has to be buy-in there. And again, it sounds terrible because it's really a brute force approach, but it really, some of these people are so ardent in their thought process, they're not, they don't want to change. And so when you educate them, and that's grassroots, right? It really just depends on the person, on the organization, but it's so hard. It really, man. And I ran into that before. And again, my approach was just I had buy-in of the CEO. I was at the time, because this effort, I was lucky, the effort was near and dear to his heart. I was able to report directly to him and tell him what I need. And so I didn't make a lot of friends, but I got a lot of stuff done. And it did change the culture, ever so slightly in the right direction. And so, if you don't have, and again, I'll go back to the original building a team. When you put together a team internally, if you're able to, if you're a security professional in a corporation, and there's a new project coming up, if you're able to build a small team like that just internally for a special project, and inject security into that process, then that can help change too. Because once one or two developers understand what you're doing and why it's important and why they don't want to get fired and why they don't want their company to be, in the news that night, once they start to understand that and understand the seriousness, then things will change. But it is, when you're transitioning at first, it is a slow and painful process.
And just echoing what you were just saying there, right? My experience, it's not that developers want to build insecure code or applications, right? They've got their goals. Security's got their goals. And if we can get those conversations happening early, again, that whole shift left effort, we can then start building things securely and get rid of that wall so that developers can really understand what it is that the security engineers are striving for. It's really building all those comms between one another. It's, the whole DevSecOps, if you will.
Right, exactly. And to put it in a different way, it's not like waterfall, right? You can't just do one thing at a time and hope that the cultures change. You have to do all of this at once, right? Either as a development manager, or as a cybersecurity leader, or CISO, whatever, CISO, you have to do all these things at once, right? You have to talk to leadership. You have to talk to middle management. You have to start this grassroots effort, and you have to do all of that simultaneously, because then you're hitting cylinders, right? Then you're starting these efforts at every single level of the organization just to build awareness.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing onto that is, to emphasize, anybody who's here, anybody here works with who thinks that they're going to run out and buy a tool or go get a certification. I'm going to go get a DevOps certification or go buy some DevOps tool off Amazon. Like that's not going to do it, right? It's as much of a people process as any automation tool. I spent many years consulting in the DevOps space, and for most customers, it's going to take them 9 months to a couple of years to really adopt and learn and start practicing this way. Like it's not an overnight, it's not a 3-month activity.
Right. That's exactly right. Yep. Well, thank you for that. Yep. I am running long, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Just very quickly, SDLC and even more importantly, SSDLC is the backbone of all good development shops. Whether you know, it has to be. It's no longer a nice to have, right? At one point, people would describe it as that, but it's no longer nice to have. It is absolutely essential to every development shop, whether it is one person sitting in their closet at 15-year-old building an app, or it's an entire development shop at Boeing, right? Security reviews and security implementation and injection into the SDLC is absolutely essential. And that's really the only thing that's going to even start to curb some of the cybercrime that we're seeing. And so everything I've said, again, for me, it was building the team, applying security at every single level of the phase as early as I possibly could, and incorporating the entire team into the process was absolutely essential. That's the only thing for me that was very, you know, that I enjoyed success with SSDLC. And even going back to a bigger team or a different team, it was still equally important. We didn't have the cool, catchy term DevSecOps or SSDLC at the time, but we were trying, right? We knew there were issues, and we were trying to apply security at different levels. But it really is a team effort. It's not one person. It's not singular, and it never was. It has to be an entire team effort. So, and regardless of team size. So, thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate being able to present to you guys. My contact information is right here. You know, if you do have questions, comments, concerns about anything that I said, please feel free to reach out. Again, I'm always in a state of learning, so I would love to hear any stories you might have. Thanks again.